So Joel, our second of the minor prophets. And Joel might be the most mysterious book in the Bible. I say that because we know nothing about the author beyond his name and the name of his dad. We don't know what Joel did for a living. We don't know where Joel lived. We know nothing about Joel. Based on the language in the book, it's suggested by some that he was involved with the temple service, but that's not definitive. So there's maybe an outside chance that Joel was a priest or a Levite, but looking at the reasons that are in there that people say he might have been a priest or a Levite, I'm like, that probably just means he lived in ancient Israel and offered sacrifices to the Lord. The other thing about Joel is that his name, he has a very common name throughout the Old Testament. There are multiple Joels in the Old Testament, and we don't believe any of them are Joel the prophet who wrote this book. Joel's name means Yahweh is God, so you can understand why many Jews would want to name their boy Joel. We don't know when Joel lived. The only historical event mentioned in the book is a locust plague, but this actually might have been the most common environmental loss in ancient Israel, was a famine caused by locusts. It would kind of be like somebody bemoaning the destruction of a hurricane in the Gulf region, and that is, even if you had a list of all the hurricanes that have struck the Gulf region, you could never know what specific hurricane that person was referring to unless they told you the name of the storm. So there's not a lot to go on for the background information of Joel. There are some people who place Joel very early amongst the minor prophets, simply because Joel is right between Hosea and Amos in the Hebrew Bible, so some people will date it around then. Other people will date Joel really early. Some people think that the book of Joel may have been written in the time period of Samuel. The reason for that is that Joel does not mention kings at all, but talks about the elders of the land. So some guess that, hey, maybe this is before there was a king of Israel. So this could be really early. The other option is to date Joel really late, and that is in Nehemiah's day. Again, a reason you're going to date it late is that there's no kings mentioned, it's just elders, which would have made sense for Nehemiah's time. Another reason that Nehemiah would probably fit a little bit better than Samuel is that there's mention of a temple. And one thing about the age of Samuel is that they didn't have a temple then, it was just the tabernacle. We don't read about Judah as a nation. We read about Israel, and it sounds like Israel is the whole nation. He writes, "Then I will enter into judgment with them on my behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they have scattered amongst the nations." So this seems to make it seem like it is post-exilic. Israel has already been scattered amongst the nations, and maybe God has brought them together. The third time period that we guess when Joel was dated was in the days of King Joash. Remember the story of Joash. Joash's grandmother, Athaliah, was a terrible, wicked, awful person, and she killed all the other people of the royal family so that grandmother Athaliah could sit upon the throne. And then after the overthrow of Athaliah, Josiah was technically king of Judah, but he didn't become king for a while because he was 8 years old, so a lot of elders and priests ruled the king in his stead. And so they say, talking about the elders leading over Judah, that maybe this was written during the early period of Joash's day, and that time period would fit for having the book of Joel fall between Hosea and Amos. So we have those three theories as to when Joel was written. And then there's one final fourth theory that is worth entertaining. As all things where there's a mystery in the Bible, there's probably 1,000 different theories, but 4 of them I think are worth entertaining. And the last theory is the one that I prefer. This is the one that I like the most, and that is I believe Joel did not want us to know when this book was written. I think he chose on a purposefully to be ambiguous. I think he purposefully chose a very repeated disaster, such as a locust plague, so we wouldn't know when this book was written. Instead, Joel was written to provide universal insight. And when I say universal, I mean that's insight for any time period in Israel's history, for how to have insight and compassion during a time of nationwide loss and devastation. So Joel, I don't think was written about the time period in which he was living, but instead Joel was written to be a guide for any time period when there was universal or nationwide devastation. And if we saw that reason for Joel, that Joel was written for a time that there is a large area-wide national loss, I think this book would end up being a lot more useful for today, because we'd be able to see, oh, there's something terrible going on in our country, something terrible going on in our region. Where's the place we should go to find compassion during this time of widespread destruction? Well, Joel was written specifically for that purpose. And I think the only sort of thing that we need to watch out for when we use Joel today is that we do need to remember that Joel was written for ancient Israel during a time period of theodicy where they were living under a specific covenant, the Mosaic covenant between Israel and God that we aren't living under today. So there are some issues with that we need to watch out for when interpreting the book. But I believe overall the book of Joel was written so that whenever Israel would have a nationwide loss in time of devastation, that this book would be what would lead them in their response to that loss and that time of devastation. So now let's look at Joel itself. We're going to start with the first 4 verses, which introduces our prophet and his problem. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. And that's everything we know about Joel. Hear this, O elders, and listen, all inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your day or in your father's days? Tell your sons about it, and let your sons tell their sons, and their sons the next generation. What the gnawing locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. And what the swarming locust has left, the creeping locust has eaten. And what the creeping locust has left, the stripping locust has eaten. So the prophet Joel tells us of a devastating locust plague that is covering the land of Israel. He speaks of the gnawing, swarming, creeping, and stripping locusts in verses 3 through 4. This has led some people to speculate, maybe there's 4 different kinds of locusts, and they're trying to figure out which one is which, and maybe different types of these bugs. But I don't think that he was saying there are 4 different kinds of locusts. I think this is probably just poetic language to describe the thoroughness of the destruction of the land. In other words, what Joel is saying is that the fields of Israel have been picked so clean by these bugs, is as if they passed over it, and then passed over it again, and passed over it again, and then passed over it again, so they could get every last stalk of green, every last grape on the vine. The land has been taken to the very last morsel, as if it was the Grinch who stole Christmas coming through the land and picking up crumbs of bread that were too small for the little whose mouses. And so this is just meant to be a picture of absolute, devastating famine on the land. And if we're going to appreciate Joel, the one thing that we got to focus on is not the locusts themselves. When we think of locusts, we think of, it's bugs. They might be disgusting, but to be honest, if you've been outside in the summer here, someplace where they have bright lights at night, you might get covered by one of those swarming termites, and, that's kind of gross and disgusting, but, you make it past that crawly kind of yuck thing. But the devastation here is not the locusts themselves, although that's gross. The devastation here is what the locust left behind. And that is what the locust left behind was no food stores. What the locust left behind, to put it in our 21st century language, is in shelf after shelf after shelf that would be empty at all of the various grocery stores that you would visit in the area. We've had some minor food scares over the last couple of years. The most recent one, obviously, that's been in the news has been the baby formula shortage. And if you talk to anybody who has an infant who's on formula right now, and they tell that story of, I know one friend that I had he's like, yesterday I went to 5 CVS's, 2 Walgreens, 2 Walmarts, and I could not find formula that I needed anywhere. And so this is the picture of, I'm trying to find bread and milk. I'm trying to get rice and beans. I'm trying to get the staples. And I'm going to store after store after store after store. And everywhere I go, the shelves are cleaned out. They are empty. And that's the picture we need to have in our mind here. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be a farmer. And you need those crops every single year to feed your family. And all of a sudden you go out into the fields and it is just, it's gone. I think in America we'd probably need at least 100 different companies to crash in order to experience anything like this. This is not just a food shortage in Israel. This is food absence. This is where you will know that the crops have been so picked clean that you're going to have family members, you're going to have people in your community who in the following weeks and months are going to starve to death. The next winter, you're going to watch people die. People are going to be so weakened at the lack of food this year, they won't be able to plant their crops in the next year. That is what they are experiencing, and it's something that it's kind of hard for us to appreciate because of the world in which we live in. So the question is, how does somebody respond to that level of devastation? And that's what the book of Joel is about. So we see the first response in verses 5 through 13. It's a longer section, and we got to go through the whole thing to get what Joel is saying. So Joel says, "Awake, drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you wine drinkers, on account of the sweet wine that is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has invaded my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has made my vine a waste, and my fig tree splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white. Wail like a virgin girded with sackcloth for the bridegroom of her youth. The grain offering and the drink offering are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priest mourn, the ministers of the Lord. The field is ruined, and the land mourns, for the grain is ruined. The new wine dries up, fresh oil fails. Be ashamed, O farmers, wail, O vine dressers, for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field is destroyed. The vine dries up, and the fig tree fails. The pomegranate, the palm also, and the apple tree. All the trees of the field dry up. Indeed, rejoicing dries up from the sons of men. Gird yourselves with sackcloth, and lament, O priests. Wail, O ministers of the altar. Come, spend the night in sackcloth, O ministers of my God. For the grain offering and the drink offering are withheld from the house of your God. So how do we respond to overwhelming destruction? Well, the first thing we do is we mourn. We mourn, we express our emotions, we don't bottle it up and pretend that it's not real. We cry and we weep. And the key to this morning is to recognize the structure of how Joel writes this section. And the structure is first seen in that is who it is that Joel initially calls out to weep and mourn. But it is the drunkards and the drinkers. So who are the drunkards and the drinkers? They are the lowest members of society. So first we gather them together and we tell them to mourn. Why do we tell them to mourn? An army has invaded and devastated the land. And what is that army here? That army is the locusts. But we can see how Joel is describing that locust, how a swarm of bugs can be a picture of a foreign invader coming into the land, or a blight on the crops of the land. Really, any devastation that could hit Israel during this time period fits well with Joel, whether it's an invading army or a whole bunch of bugs. So he begins by saying, drunkards, weep because you've been pillaged like a lion devouring its prey. And then the next group that Joel calls to weep and wail in verse 8 is you virgins. You virgins, weep like girls who are getting ready to marry this year, but when it comes for your wedding day to arrive, you learn that the one who you were going to marry has died. And so now you have to mourn because there will be no feasting. There will be no rejoicing, and the priests are called to mourn with the virgin. And then in verse 11, it is the farmers who mourn. And the farmers, they might have mourned the most. I mean, how awful and shame-filled would it be for people to depend upon you for their bread and their wine, and all of a sudden you have nothing but bare stalks and dirt in your fields. They just weep. And it will be the farmers that will bear the shame and open. So he's gone to the drunkards, and then the virgins, and then the farmers. And then finally in verse 13, it is the ministers at the altar who mourn. And the ministers at the altar would have specifically not just been any priest, but these would have been the high priests. And they are the highest level of the land, and they should not be divorced from the needs of the people, but they should weep with them. So if we put all these groups together, from the drunkards to the priests offering the sacrifice in the temple, what we find Joel doing is a picture of calling all of the people in the land, from the least in the land to the greatest in the land, to all mourn over this loss together. So what Joel is saying, the first thing that you do when there's a time of devastation is that you need to open the eyes of all the people in the land to the reality of this situation, whether they are the least in the land or the most important in this land. The drunkards and the priests, I think, also have something else in common when it comes to calling on them to mourn, is that the two people that might not have noticed that there was a famine going on were the drunkards and the priests. The drunkards because, well, they're drunkards and they don't notice a lot of things. But the priests, if anybody would have been sort of sheltered and maybe isolated from this devastation, it's the priests, because they're not actually working in the fields. They're supposed to be getting the first fruits of everybody's crops. So if anybody should be getting crops, it should be the priests. But Joel wants to make sure that all of the people know just how devastating this is. And I think this is an important part of a time of loss, to make sure that everyone knows the extent of the problem that is going on. I think hurricanes are a good example of this, because I think one of the interesting things I didn't really notice so much until you move down here and you're living here firsthand and you have a storm go through, is just sort of how insane it is at times after a storm goes through, where you could drive down one neighborhood and be like, oh man, this storm wasn't bad at all. Everything looks fine. And then you could be, 3 minutes down the road and be like, holy cow, this storm, this took out everything. We had that tornado come through New Orleans East recently, and I drove past that area like 2 days after the storm happened, and everything's fine. And then all of a sudden you pass this 2-block radius, and it's just like, man, it took out everything. And so part of this is Joel saying, you need to let everybody know about this time of loss. So when there's a time of loss, we all need to mourn together. Sorrow is the right response. We need to console each other, and we need to make sure that when we're doing this consoling, that we're letting every person know, even those that might not miss the reality of this devastation, what it is that is happening, so that we can all come together. And then that brings us to the next response in verse 14, which can only happen if you first practice verses 5 through 13. Verse 14 says, consecrate a fast, proclaim a solemn assembly. Gather the elders and all the inhabitants of the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Now, I think out of everything in this chapter, this is probably the one verse that is most fitting simply for national Israel and maybe not for us today. And this is to call everybody together for a national fast together. This is not to say that we shouldn't fast at times during devastation or loss. Jesus talks about how fasting is a good practice for his followers. We just got to make sure that when we're fasting, we're not doing it so that everyone will know that we're fasting. We're simply doing it to spend increased time in prayer before the Lord and to focus on his quietness. On his goodness, but this idea of a national assembly, calling everyone together, to me is rooted a lot in the political nature of national Israel. This would also not just be a time of fasting to go before the Lord, but this would also be a time of gathering sort of the best and the elders of the land to come together and say, okay, we got no more food. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to make it through the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months? What's going to be our plan? What's going to be our working for this? So we might look at verse 14 as something very spiritual with them fasting and calling out and crying to the Lord. But we need to remember that Joel was written to a political entity nation. That at this time period, Israel was a group of people living in a specific boundary, specific border, had rulers, had elders, and this is sort of calling together and saying, we've had this loss. How do we respond to this in this time? So this is about coming together as a nation to have a logical response for this time period, which is something we should do as well. A time of devastation comes through, you meet together and figure out what's the best way to respond to this situation. So we fast, we call upon the Lord, we have an assembly, and then we wait for the Christ, for the Messiah to come. And we get our next advice in verses 15 through 18. Alas for the day of the Lord is near, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty. Had not food been cut off before our eyes, gladness and joy from the house of our God. The seeds shrivel under their clods. The storehouses are desolate. The barns are torn down, for the grain is dried up. How the beasts groan. The herds of cattle wander aimlessly, because there is no pasture for them. Even the flocks of sheep suffer. So when we think of the day of the Lord, we normally see this term in an eschatological focus, as in the day of the Lord is the end time when Christ, the Messiah, will return in judgment and power and set up his kingdom on this earth. But the day of the Lord was a more general term throughout the Old Testament and the prophets. It referred to any time of judgment from the Lord. So when Assyria or Babylon or Rome came in and took out God's people, wiped them out at various times, you could call each of those time periods the day of the Lord, a day of judgment. And I don't think by saying for the day of the Lord is near that Joel also was saying God's judgment was coming. But I think Joel was talking about they were in the midst of that devastation already. But if you think about the nature of a locust famine, the judgment would not have been felt immediately in that moment. But if you had a locust famine where the fields were picked clean, when would you feel the pain of the locusts? It would be weeks, months later when the food you have in your barn houses or stored up in your house, when that food was all gone. So it wouldn't be an immediate judgment, but it would be a coming devastation. So I think when Joel's saying the day of the Lord is near, I don't think he's saying there's a future judgment coming, but the pain of this judgment it's at hand. It is about to arrive. And by tying this sorrow to the day of the Lord, I think Joel was trying to lead the people to see God's sovereignty in these difficult times. That even in times of darkness and loss, God is still in control. That just because this plague has swept over the land, it doesn't mean that God has left the land, but God still rules and God still reigns. And it reminds us that even in difficult times in our own life, we need to remember that God still rules over this world. That our God is the same in times of abundance and in times of loss. that we need to look to God as our King in times of sorrow and rejoicing, and in also times of devastation and times of heartbreak. And it's very important in these times where everything seems way too expensive and we can't afford things like we used to not just focus on the high prices, the empty cupboards, and to fall into despair, but we need to continue to remember God. And we need to remember that God has plans that last far beyond this current trial. So to call this famine the day of the Lord was Joel's way to recognize that God is still God. Even when those locusts were flying into the towns and flying throughout the land, the Lord wasn't sitting up there in heaven chewing his fingernails and saying, "Oh no, locusts, what am I going to do about these bugs flying into Israel? I don't know if I can handle all of this." God wasn't acting that way at all. The Lord was as secure in his throne and in his rule before the plague as he was after the plague. And God continues to reign today, and we are to continue to trust in him. And I think one thing that would probably help us a little bit today is if we got back to using that day of the Lord language a little bit more. I mean, we have disasters that come upon us. How often do we talk about how this disaster is here and God is still reigning and ruling while it is happening? Normally today when we talk about natural disasters, we talk in language that frankly sounds more like modern environmentalism religion than we talk about people who believe that God rules and reigns over the land. And Joel never forgot the fact that these locusts are coming into the land, and maybe this is just a seasonal thing, but God is still reigning over this. So we need to remind ourselves that a storm getting whipped up in the Gulf is not just all about natural causes and the earth and the environment and all that, but God is reigning and ruling at all times. So that is one thing that Joel wants us to focus on. And our final point is in verses 19 and 20 when we see the importance of crying to the Lord. To you, O Lord, I cry, for fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and the flame has burned up all the trees of the field. Even the beasts of the field pant for you, for the water brooks are dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures of the wilderness. So saving this response to the conclusion really wraps up something that's been throughout all of Joel chapter 1, and that is the importance of responding to times of tragedy, primarily by calling out to the Lord with our heart and with our emotions. And this is one thing that, frankly, we are just not very good at as modern Western Christians. The picture in Joel is a picture of crying out, of proclaiming loudly and publicly to the Lord. We need to understand that when Joel writes about crying out to the Lord, his initial audience, when they read this, they would have thought, okay, we're going to go outside publicly, we're going to wail, we're going to mourn, we're going to rip our clothes, we're going to throw ashes on our heads, and we're going to lay it all to bear. The word cry means to cry with bitter tears and loud lament. It is to express your grief, your disappointments, and your fears. It's to come to God honestly with your pain and to lay it before him. And, we have a problem with this today. We have a hard time expressing our depression and our anxiety and our emotions before the Lord. And one thing we need to remember is that emotions they're a gift from the Lord. God gave us emotions specifically to help us process things that are too big for our minds to wrap themselves around, for us to process burdens that are too heavy for us to carry. When things get to be too much for us, we are to release those emotions before the Lord and cry out to him. And one thing we should always remember is that we don't need to worry about offending God when we bring our raw emotions before him. He can handle all of the emotions that we would bring before him. In fact, I believe that God wants our emotions. And if you think about it, God was the one who decided to make us emotional creatures after all. That's how God designed us. So it is good and right for us to cry out to God before tragedies, to unleash that anger that is inside our hearts. If you just look through the book of Psalms, the Psalms can be brutal, they can be graphic. I never realized just how brutal the Psalms were and graphic in emotions until when I went to my church in West Groton. One thing that I decided to have us do there during my time there was we began every service with the reading of a psalm. That's just how we started each service. I'd come up or somebody else would, and we'd read through all of a psalm or part of a psalm. And once I started having us do that and going through the Psalms, I realized there are so many Psalms that I cannot do this with. Like there are so many that are not appropriate for the beginning of a worship service, because just the emotions in these Psalms are they're so raw and brutal. And so Joel is telling us to take all of those emotions and to cry out to the Lord. And one thing I want to also note again in verses 19 and 20 is that Joel shifts imagery again. So here he turns to the image of a fire. So we should notice in chapter 1 that he begins with the locusts who sweep through 4 times, and then he uses the image of an army. He follows the image of the army with the image of a lion, follows the image of a lion with the image of a virgin who has lost her bridegroom right before they are to be married, and then finally ends with the image of a forest fire, picturing how the locust just would have wiped out the field as if a fire had gone through and cleared out the countryside. And I wanted to sort of highlight all of those different images in chapter 1 in a row to sort of drive home my point even more on why locusts would have made an ideal fertile soil for really any type of devastation they might have. So whether it's a fire going through the countryside, whether it's someone that you loved who was killed by a wild animal traveling from town to town, or the emotional devastation of a young girl losing the man she is just about to be married to. That's the type of loss that we can't appreciate today that happened far more often back in the days of Joel. Or locusts clearing out the field. That Joel is trying to help us in all of those periods of heartbreak, so that we can have hope for our future and hope for future generations. And one thing that we should also consider reading this book and understanding that kind of purpose for it, and that is Joel wanted to use his locust famine not only to help him, but I also believe to help all the other Israelites who would endure famines in future generations, regardless of what the time period is, to remind us that one of the reasons that God brings grief and pain into our lives as his people is specifically so we can comfort and be gracious to other people in their times of loss and in their times of grief. I don't know if I've shared this part of the sort of journey I had when Isaac had his heart surgery. I don't think I've mentioned it here before, but it's a big moment in our life, so obviously it has lots of fertile illustration soil for me. But shortly after Isaac's birth, I've mentioned before, we realized Isaac had a real big hole in his heart, and it was going to have to be fixed with surgery at some point soon in his life. Well, after Isaac was born, we had another little baby girl born in our church 3 or 4 months right behind Isaac. And as it turned out, she was also diagnosed with a hole in her heart. She had a heart murmur, almost like Isaac's, just a little bit smaller than Isaac's had. Thankfully, their daughters ended up healing all on its own, and so she didn't even need to have surgery for it. But they ended up talking about, and this was after the whole process was all, gone through for them, was that one of the things that sort of carried them through the process of their health issue with their daughter was watching us go through the same exact thing 3 or 4 months ahead of them. And the way that we handled Isaac's diagnosis and then everything with the doctors and the surgeries gave them hope and encouragement that they could make it through the same thing with their own little girl. That even when I stood up in the church, and when I first told the church that Isaac had a hole in his heart and he was going to have heart surgery, I broke down crying about halfway through. And they were like, that had a huge impact on us. Like, you standing up and laying it out and letting everybody know and crying over it was just a major point for us in being able to make it through with our own daughter. And one of the ways that they were able to trust and have confidence in God was walking the same path that we had. And interestingly enough, we had friends from seminary who lived like 3 hours from us in another part of upstate New York, and they had a boy who was born a year before Isaac, who had a hole in his heart, who had the same heart surgery that Isaac had in the same hospital with the same heart doctor. And so we were able to talk to them about everything before they went through with that. And so I just was able, through us and being after somebody else, before another family, was able to see in a real powerful way how you going through a time of grief can really help somebody else who goes through a time of grief as well. And I think that's a lot of the purpose of Joel, is that Joel's had a time of loss and a time of famine in his day, and he wanted to take his grief and use that to help others that would follow.